Okay, I'm going to talk about competition and kind of the implications it has on our economy. But to get there, first, I'm going to kind of talk about competition more broadly. So, when we typically think of competition, we think human versus human, or, like combat sports, even, or sports. But let's ultimately, competition is human versus environment. And humans can be part of that environment, and by extension, competition can be human versus human, right? So, to kind of give you a dichotomy between two different types of competition that humans often find themselves in, we'll, we'll say that first we'll start with the human versus environment, where the environment is the dominant competitor, right? So, this is common in physically laborious jobs, right? Physical labor. So you're kind of competing with gravity, or maybe you're competing with the sunlight, right? The heat, or even the cold, right? Where do we see these types of jobs? Well, they're all over the place, right? But they're really common in, I don't know, farm work, right? If you work on a farm in some rural area, you're gonna be working really hard against that environment, and your competition is going to be high, right? The competition against that environment is high. It's hard work, and the end result of that hard work, that high level of competition, is it's stressful, right? It's going to take years off your life because of that physical stress. Now, here's the thing: what can we do to diminish that competition, to ease the stress? Well, again, you can avoid it, right? In effect, you're running from that competition. It's a flight response in this case. There's two responses to competition. It's a flight response or a fight response. You either do the physical labor and take on the stress that it implicates, or you run from it. So, if you live in a rural area and there's few jobs available to you, maybe you end up working on a farm, and again, you're busting your ass all day. And that stress, it's not good long term. It's going to cause a lot of stress, and it's going to cause some years to be taken off your life. So in this case, it kind of makes sense to choose the flight response a little bit. Now, maybe you don't completely quit the farm job, but maybe you move to more of I don't know, more of a urban area. Maybe not completely urban, but suburban. Maybe you move to the outskirts of a suburb, and you're still working a little bit at the farm, but in order to diminish the stress that comes from that farm work, you get a job at a grocery store, a part-time job in some suburb, while still working at the farm, right? You diminish that competition, and you reduce the stress in your life. So, on the flip side of this, we could think of a big city. Like, imagine New York City. There's not a ton of physical labor, right? But there's still plenty of stressful labor. And that comes in the form of, the competition with humans in this case, rather than, competition with your environment. So you're competing with humans to climb this corporate ladder, and because the cost of living in New York City is so high, you gotta climb that ladder. Otherwise, you're not gonna be able to make a living. And again, that stress, that competition, it causes a lot of. It's ultimately going to cause or take years off of your life, right? It's going to reduce your longevity in the same way that the high competition on the farm, the high competition with the environment on the farm did. So, the point I'm trying to get across here is that competition causes stress. High levels of competition cause stress, and the stress is hard on your body. So, in both cases, we can make an argument that instead of fighting that competition, we pull away from it. We run from it a little bit, right? The flight response, rather than fight responses, we run from the competition, and in order to ease the stress that comes from the high level of competition. So, in effect, you end up in the suburb, and you end up working a diversified, maybe a diversified occupations, right? You get a few different jobs instead of digging into one job that has high competition. You kind of ease the stress by having a few different occupations. Now, we could also imagine another scenario. Just imagine, say you're in a violent area, and there's a high likelihood of you getting robbed at night if you're walking through some dark alley in some inner city, okay? This is a high competition area, right? You're going to end up competing with potentially violent people who want to rob you, right? They want to steal your stuff. And again, there's two options here. You can either choose to prepare to fight that competition, or you can run from it. Now, in this case, a fight response would be, maybe you learn some self-defense techniques. Maybe you learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or you start boxing, or maybe you carry a knife. But in all likelihood, because of that high competition, because both parties are aware of the high competition, the person robbing you is probably going to have a knife too, or a gun or something. So in this case, there's some mutually assured destruction, right? You're going to there's some mutually assured damage between both parties. If you both have knives, you're both going to end up both of you are going to end up with some wounds, right? So it makes logical sense to instead run from the situation. Run from high levels of competition to avoid the stress and to avoid the damage. And this robbery scenario is not a whole lot different than the other two scenarios, right? If you have two people competing for some CEO level job, they're both going to be so stressed out that they're both going to take damage from that stress. And in the same on the farm, right? If you have two people working, everyone working against that, in that harsh environment, against the environment, is going to take on lots of stress. In all of these situations, it makes sense to run from the stress and to seek the environment that is perhaps less stressful. And what would that look like? Well, again, kind of more of a suburban area, right? Where there's a wider variety of occupations available, and where the competition is not so high. Now, here's the cool thing about this, though, and here's what I'm going to tie it into the economy more so. So, if everyone were to do this, if everyone were to kind of avoid, to move away from these high competition areas, these stressful occupations, what would happen? Well, what would happen is all these these large inner city populations would end up populating the suburbs, and then those suburbs would end up populating, the rural areas. And in effect, the competition eases at those extremes, at the the New York City extreme and the rural extreme. The competition and the available occupations, the opportunity of different occupations, expands everywhere. And this is really good for the economy, and I'm going to explain why. Because what happens when you do this is you bring all those people in the inner city closer to the rural areas where all the food's being produced. And in effect, you reduce the stress in those cities and the stress in the rural area by bringing more opportunity to them. And the end result is that we localize the production of goods and services. Now, this has a lot of implications. Okay, first of all, if you live in some rural area where you have to drive 2 hours to get to the grocery store, you can now you can drive 10 minutes. Okay, now there's a grocery store right next to you or maybe a hardware store, because maybe you're in a rural area, you have food, right, but you don't have access to the hardware store, right? So now you can drive 10 minutes to the hardware store because the production of those goods are localized to you now. Likewise, the people who used to live in the inner city, the big city, now they can get their food locally. Okay, the end result of this is, again, the production of goods and services are localized, and this reduces the transportation of those goods and services, reduces the transit time, reduces the climate change associated with the fossil fuels. It's a win-win across the board. It reduces the stress that people are put in these high competition environments. Again, it's just wins across the board. And if you think about it, it just makes sense. If you think about our current infrastructure, the way we've designed the production of goods and services and how they're and where they're located, you know, there's not a whole lot of cities that are necessarily close to rural areas where the food is being produced. And that's a really dumb way to design infrastructure, because we have these truck drivers driving millions of miles just to transport goods and services where they're needed. And in fact, that hurts the climate change issue. We're using more fossil fuels. It causes, again, more stress in those high competition environments. If we ease the competition and spread it out, and in effect localize the production of goods and services, it makes the economy so much more efficient. And you have to think about the reasons why it's currently structured the way it is. It's because when we were building these cities, we built them based on what was useful to us at the time. It just we weren't thinking in the long term. And now that we are, now that we have kind of seen our mistakes, we can start thinking about ways to better structure our infrastructure. There's this YouTube channel, I think it's called Not Just Bikes. I think that's what it's called. I haven't checked it out in a while, but they talk about the poor infrastructure in this country. We separate all of the occupational, we separate the places we work from the places we live, and then we have to drive to those places. And then if you want to get goods and services, if you want to go to the store, you have to drive in a different direction over here. And we separate them by miles and miles of just roads that are not benefiting us, that are insanely inefficient. And the end result is that if you don't have a car, you're screwed. And here's the thing: there are some good places in this country that are designed well, and I happen to live in one of them. Okay, Ohio there's a lot of bike trails here. There's a lot of local businesses, and beyond that, you have to think about why Ohio is good. And the reason is because it lies, a few reasons actually. It lies between New York City and Chicago. So for these corporations, it makes sense for them to it makes sense for Amazon to build a bunch of warehouses in Ohio, because again, it's between those two massive population centers. And Ohio also has a lot of farmland. Okay, and so in that sense, it's kind of a bit of a sweet spot. It's a bit of a heartland, actually, because it has a lot of. It's not a bad example for how to structure the larger infrastructure. But yet, you go a little bit farther west, and you have just swaths of farmland, just miles and miles of farmland, and barely any big cities, right? We have these massive gaps between the big cities and the farmland. Yet, the people have to eat the food that's being grown on the farms. It just doesn't make any sense. There are much better ways to structure our infrastructure, and if we embrace them and forget about our the old systems, and realize that we weren't thinking when we created that old infrastructure, then we can become a lot more efficient. And again, as I said, it helps the climate. It reduces all these trucks that are driving across the country for almost no reason at all. And if you can even think about water. I mean, we have the entire states that are dependent on water being shit, affected water being transited at hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles. I'm not sure, probably hundreds. It just doesn't make any sense the way we have built the infrastructure in this country. We need to rethink it and we can frame it in this mind of competition that I've given to you. What'll happen is the reason I started this video out talking about competition was because to make the point about the stress that competition brings. Okay, obviously there are more benefits than just reducing stress, such as the climate change problems and the localization of production, but it will also help the stress. So just think about that. Think about the way we've structured our infrastructure and try to think about ways that it can be improved. Again, check out that channel called Not Just Bikes. They talk about the stroads in these suburban areas where you have to drive miles to get to work and then miles to get to the store, and then you go back, and there's no ability for anyone to travel on foot or on a bike because we make these 10-lane wide roads that you can't realistically travel as a pedestrian. Again, I happen to live in a pretty well-designed area in my mind. Now, obviously, there are better designed areas, but the thing is if you look at a big city and credit them for being well-designed, you're forgetting about the fact that the cost of living in those cities is insane. And the reason it's insane is because it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. All the corporations are centered there, and you have to compete at this high level to make a living there, and in effect you have to put yourself in a very stressful environment. You have to put a bunch of stress on yourself. If we kind of all stop, it's kind of like we're specializing in the production of all our goods and services, and that's all right. The specialization is okay, but when we separate the specialization with millions of miles, thousands of miles, it hurts us a lot. That's the difference that's the problem with specialization, is that if you allow it to put all the businessmen thousands of miles from where all the food's being grown, that's a really dumb way to structure an economy. It's a really, or an infrastructure rather. So our economy, it could be vastly improved by reducing the stress that we put on ourselves in order to make a living, in addition to the reduction in fossil fuel usage and the ability, and by improving the infrastructure in effect. We need to aim to localize the production of goods and services. And you can think about this on a worldwide level as well. If all of the microchips are being produced in Taiwan, then all of the world's superpowers are going to start fighting over Taiwan. Instead, if you just started producing the microchips locally everywhere, then nobody has to fight over them. And it's really interesting to think about, because China, they need the microchips, but they had no intention of taking control over Taiwan until the US threatened to do it themselves. China's building roads in the east. We are building military bases. The United States is building military bases. Think about the difference between those two things, and think about the end result of the effect on the infrastructure it has had in the United States, right? We're building military bases, and our infrastructure is falling apart. China is spending all of their money on roads and rail, right? There's this idea I thought of to build like a bullet train idea in the United States. Imagine like a giant oval going across the United States, west to east and east to west, right? And then you have kind of like branches off that go to, the major population centers and elsewhere, that branch off of that giant oval. And those branches have pods, right? They have pods that people get on. They get on the pod, The pod speeds up, attaches to the back of the bullet train. They unload onto the train. The pod detaches, goes to the next population center, and picks people up. Basically, you could have a bullet train that never stops, that just goes in a circle, or rather several trains running on this oval track around the United States. And the end result would be a very efficient mode of transfer across the United States. And you could even make one for goods and services that transfer. I mean, we have some rail, but we could improve this stuff we have. There are so many improvements that can be made in this United States to the United States infrastructure, and we're just not thinking about it logically. Instead, we're worried about Taiwan and Ukraine, and we're fighting wars over oil. That's the interesting thing. Again, if all of our oil, all of our energy production is coming from the Middle East, then we're going to be fighting over the Middle East instead of finding other alternative energy sources that can be domesticated or that can be locally produced. So if you got a lot of wind in one place, use the wind energy. If you've got a big river, build a dam. If you've got oil reserves, maybe use the oil. We have to think about localizing the necessities. That is the key here. That is the key to a strong economy. Localize the production of necessities everywhere, and we will maximize efficiency. So, localize energy, localize housing, localize food production, localize jobs. Instead, we have these specialized areas. We have an agricultural section where we grow all our food, and then we ship it to where all the people live, and it doesn't make any sense. It's just so illogical. And if we don't actually get somebody in charge of things in this country that is thinking logically, then we're going to keep building military bases, and we're going to keep destroying the infrastructure that is already in shambles in this country. So just give that a little thought. Thanks for watching.